welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Chris Kitchener.
And with me, Gareth Tennant.
In this podcast, we explore ideas and concepts around teams and teamwork, leaders and leadership, and all things in between. It's a discussion between a former Royal Marines officer and a product manager from the world of business, comparing and contrasting our experiences as we attempt to work out what makes teams, leaders, and businesses tick. It is a very pleasant spring evening. The sun is shining us on what remains of the sun, and the birds are singing. And I have no idea whether these microphones pick up the birds singing.
I don't think they will, but I think they might pick up any helicopters that fly over, and they will certainly pick up your dog barking or my dog barking if and when that happens.
So this seems like a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
Well, today is a topic of your choice, but to be fair, it's a topic that I think makes a lot of sense given the way the world has been going.
Yeah.
Gareth, what's your topic for today?
So we've talked a lot on the podcast about strategy, and we've talked a little bit about politics, although we have explicitly said it's not a political podcast.
Do we do well on that?
I don't know. I think we, without meaning to, maybe get a bit political at times, but that's fine. But I think the glue that kind of, or the currency maybe, that links these two things together, I think, is power. And so I want to explore the relationship between strategy, politics, and power.
It's funny, is power feels like a dirty word.
Yeah.
I don't know that we use good words, strategy, command. These are all sort of considered very good, clean. I keep using the word clean, but they seem to be words that are acceptable. But power somehow makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable. That's not true. It doesn't make me feel uncomfortable, but there's something about the word power that I think has positive and negative connotations.
Well,
so why did you want to talk about power per se?
So I read a book probably about 5 years ago by a chap called Moises Naim called The End of Power. And it's a fascinating book that sort of explores where society is, I mean, it's 5 years old now, 5 or 6 years old, but where society is changing, where technology, connected technologies, the internet, now with the rise of machine learning and artificial intelligence, as well as some of the sort of geopolitical trends that we're seeing. His thesis was basically that power is shifting, and particularly power is diluting. Over the last couple of years, since we've seen resurgent Russia attack Ukraine, and we've now got a hard power, high intensity conflict in Europe, which I don't think anybody was sort of envisaging for the previous sort of 20 years before that. We've got a Trump administration that is certainly using the tools of the Constitution, the tools of the state, as well as changing and breaking those institutions to consolidate power. It's got me thinking about whether actually power is diluting and whether there is some validity in what Moises Naim says, or whether that book is, one of those things that will be consigned to history as we thought we were on this path, but it turns out there were lots of other things going on.
I'm always, whenever someone declares that there's something new or something has dramatically changed, I have to say I've got a little bit of a tendency to say, what if you zoomed out a little bit more? Actually, is it as different or as new as you think? So I'm imagining, and I haven't read the book, I'm imagining part of this is the internet has allowed power to be dispersed. And I would imagine you can talk about sort of the various revolutions that have been supported and enabled by the internet. But I am quite cautious about declaring that's anything new, because you could say the printing press caused a similar kind of a well, now we're giving power to other people, but the people who own the printing presses and what goes on the printing presses, they sure do seem to have a lot of power. I'm fascinated by this idea of the modern, and I hate this term, but it amuses me, the tech bros, the Mark Zuckerbergs of this world, who, on one hand, you could argue have enabled the distribution of power, but on the other hand, they seem to be awfully powerful themselves.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you look at Mark Zuckerberg, you look at Mr. Bezos, you look at various people of this nature, and you would say they seem to be very powerful. And we look at Elon Musk, of course. This is a man who, without any democratic positioning, actually has power in a very real sense in the United States. He has gone in and done things. So
Yeah.
I don't know.
I think,
I'm open to be convinced,
yeah.
but I wonder whether the world just evolves and the natural ebb and flow of power continues.
I don't think Moises Naim would argue with that. It's been a while since I've read the book. I took a flick through it earlier today just to try and remind myself of sort of the chapter headings. And then I cheated a little bit by getting a large language model to summarize it for me. But from what I remember, he's not arguing that there's anything new. He's arguing that in that ebb and flow, we're at the peak of a wave and we're about to drop into this trough of the dilution of power. On your point about Elon Musk, I think Elon Musk is a really, really good example because Elon Musk is somebody who, as an individual, has consolidated quite a lot of power. And arguably, again, not new. We saw, the Rockefellers of the world do it 150 years ago. So we've seen consolidation of industrial power before. But he also runs a company that is also, or runs several companies, but Tesla as one, has a huge amount of market power. And, Amazon with Jeff Bezos or Facebook with Mark Zuckerberg. And I remember having a conversation a few years ago with a friend of mine who's from the Republic of Ireland and talking about the fact that the Irish economy and the huge amount of growth that Ireland has gone through very impressively over the last couple of decades is based on their low tax economy. And the fact that a huge amount of American, particularly tech businesses, are based out of Dublin, and that has generated a huge amount of wealth and a huge amount of jobs for the Irish economy, but it has also left them as a relatively small country, very, very exposed to 2 or 3 very powerful commercial organisations. And there was a point a few years ago where effectively Google had the majority of Ireland's national debt in money that it owed to the Irish state. And then the US government, I think it was under the first Trump administration or during the first Trump administration, but I could be wrong, were talking about changing the rules and effectively withholding that money, and it led to a constitutional crisis in Ireland. And it was really interesting because that is effectively one company lobbying, or a group of 2 or 3 companies headed by some very powerful individuals. So you could probably count on one hand the people that are lobbying these decisions, and then an executive branch of the US government being incentivized by individuals and commercial organizations to effectively force countries
To behave in a
to
certain way.
behave in a certain way. But
Well, are we ahead of ourselves?
Probably.
Should we talk about what the definition, or at least our definition of power is?
Yeah.
We've kind of poked at it a little bit.
I got a load of quotes together. And then when you started and said power is, potentially a dirty word, strategy is a clean word, I realised that the one quote I don't have is the Batman quote of "with great power comes great responsibility," which I suppose indicates that power is neutral in that it is we'll talk about the definition in a minute, but power is potentially a neutral thing, but can be wielded to have very, very positive or very, very negative consequences. So yeah, what do you think the definition is?
So, as always, you scribble something down. I think at its simplest level, it's the ability to influence others or influence outcomes, which we've kind of talked
Yeah.
about. But I think it's one of these things that can be at a very, you've just talked about nation states exerting power, and we have just seen this recently in terms of tariffs. The United States
Yeah.
put tariffs on countries saying you will do what we say you will do, otherwise these are the bad outcomes. One thing that I think is quite interesting, because it's one of these scalable concepts, which is it can be in a small organization all the way through to a nation state. This is the ability to influence. And I love the sort of the second piece of this, which it can be formal or informal, and formality
Yeah.
coming from a role or a set of rules, or informal from reputation, charisma, or your ability to control resources and by definition influence
Yeah.
people. So there's a lot going on in there, but I almost go back to the beginning, which is it's the ability to influence others or influence outcomes, no matter how you do it
Yeah.
or at what scale you do it.
So I sort of looked up various definitions of power, and of course there are social definitions and philosophical definitions, but there are also definitions of power in physics. So there's electrical power, there's mechanical power, there's mathematical power, which are not necessarily what we're talking about, but I think the etymology of the word comes from the same place. And if we take the definition from physics, which is the rate at which work is done or energy is transferred over time, I think that quite neatly summarizes the fact that it is the transfer of, in this case, energy from one place to another, or from one thing to another. And that indicates there's a relationship between things, which goes to your point about influence. So I think for me, power is about the transfer of influence, and perhaps that's still a little bit esoteric, it's about the transfer of behavioral change. So Max Weber, who's a philosopher, said power is defined as the probability that one actor with a social relationship will be in a position to carry out their own will despite resistance. So he is arguing that it is about doing things, making things happen, perhaps when other actors want something different. So there's a resistance element to it. I like the fact that it's about relationships between entities. Of course, we can start to then think about relationships between lots of entities, and the fact that if you pool resources, you can have collective power. So, I'm sure we'll come on to that. So yeah, I think that's probably a very good place to start. There's quite a nice set of phrases that I think help situate the relationship between power, strategy, and politics. So, and we can discuss, agree, disagree with them, but power is the currency of politics and the purpose of strategy.
Is it the purpose of strategy? I don't know that the purpose of a strategy is power.
So, if we take my definition of strategy, which I will remind you and the listeners, is the ability to achieve things over the long term under conditions of uncertainty, then you can start to deconstruct that and say, if power is about getting things done, and when there's resistance or when there's a relationship that involves something else, then that is probably analogous to the uncertainty. The fact that there is an environment that doesn't necessarily fit with your plan. So you have to adapt, you have to.
But is the implication that you can achieve your strategy without power, but if there is resistance, then you need power to achieve that strategy? Do you know what I mean? As in,
Yeah.
listen, if the point is there's a clear, we need to do a thing, and everyone says we should do the thing, there's no power needed. If there's consensus, if there's agreement, if there's a clear path,
But I
you
think
don't
if there's a
necessarily need
clear
power.
path and everybody agrees and it's just a case of doing, then it's not strategic.
So your implication is strategy means a change of some sort. and a change comes. And there's a little bit of a semantic discussion here, but
I think it's an important one though. So remember the difference between strategy and tactics. Tactics is using resources, using capability to do things. So if there's no external resistance, if the plan is build an A-frame, I'm defaulting back to command tasks in my youth, but if the plan is build an A-frame and you've got some bits of wood and some rope, then it's not a strategic challenge.
I feel it's going towards the tactics and strategy discussion, but I don't know that that's necessarily the most important line to go down. I do think we should get back to power and the use of it.
How about we take it from a different perspective then? Strategy navigates politics to secure or use power.
Say that again.
Strategy navigates politics to secure or use power.
Yeah, that's a convoluted way of saying it, but obviously the point you're making is these things are related and are connected to deliver particular sort of set of an outcome.
Yeah, so I think what I'm saying there is strategy has to take into account the political landscape and as I've said, strategy is not just a technical plan, but it can act in the conditions of uncertainty. So it's a political act. And the currency, I'm going back to my first phrase, of that relationship is power, because you are shifting power in order to achieve things. And presumably you have options to take power, to consolidate power, or to give power to enable others. And you will make choices as to whether that is beneficial to your end state, to your objectives.
Can I have a different go at the same thing?
Yeah, please do.
I think it's the same thing, but I like this. Strategy without power is dreaming without doing.
Strategy without power is dreaming without doing.
I've got a strategy,
but
I can't do it. If you don't have power, even a brilliant strategy might not get implemented. And then we're going around a triangle here almost.
Yeah, absolutely.
Power without strategy is force without a direction.
Yeah.
I am going to get you to do things, and I don't know what it is we're trying to achieve. Chaos, inefficiency, harmful outcomes. And by the way,
good noise before defeat, as Sun Tzu would say.
Well, you see, you know Sun Tzu better than I do. But I think that one's really interesting because I think both of those we can recognize from the real world. So in my world, a product manager might have the best idea, or you might call it the best strategy, but without influence, in this case power, or a stakeholder, and we'll get to politics in a minute, maybe nothing will happen. Likewise, that's true around the military world. But the final one is then that politics shapes both of these. So you need to understand the political landscape to craft a strategy, and that strategy has to exist in the real world and not just on paper. So I like the strategy without power is dreaming without doing. Power without strategy is force without direction.
So we've spent a bit of time talking about what we think power is and the definition. We've looked at, and arguably I've kind of railroaded us into looking at my definition of strategy. There are many definitions out there. What we haven't done is explored what we think politics is. So if politics is what shapes the environment in which strategy operates, what do we think politics is?
Oh, I don't know. Don't ask me that. I'm comfortable about strategy. I'm going to not answer your question by talking about my well, no, this might be relevant actually. I hope it is, otherwise this is all a bit pointless and people should stop listening now. I hear lots of people come to me and say, I hate office politics.
Yeah.
And the shaping of the office world, which I might describe as politics, is considered to be bad.
Yeah.
I hate all the politics is a phrase you hear often. And what I talk to people about is I wonder whether you need to rethink your definition of politics. If what they often mean is there is a person who is trying to gain power, and to gain power, they drive a particular outcome. And so it's all about, I'm going to do the thing that gets me the most power. That is their definition of politics.
Yeah.
For me, my definition of politics, rightly or possibly wrongly, is the things you need to do to shape the conversations you have to create the most effective outcome. And in terms of our
I think you're getting dangerously close to strategy there
well, no,
within
well,
the environment that is
it's
political.
because we've used the word strategy.
Yeah.
Actually, you might be true. Here's what I mean, which is I need to build a relationship with that person over there.
Yeah.
Because if I don't build a relationship with that person over there, I will be unable to execute on my strategy, or that person
Yeah.
can significantly help me. Now, that's not, and by the way, there's another word for politics, arse kissing. Lots of people I know think that's very bad. That is the understanding of saying, I understand other people's goals and objectives.
Yeah.
I understand my goals and objectives, and I am looking for alignment, coalition, and associations to help me drive my outcomes.
Yeah.
And almost certainly in doing so, drive some of their outcomes as well.
So I like the word alignment, and I like it because what I think you're describing there is navigating through a political landscape. So
Yes.
politics is the misalignment of different people or organisations' goals, and therefore to navigate through that, part of what you need to do is be strategic by trying to either align people's goals or remove power from people that don't have the same goals, or
Yeah.
convince people that what they need to do is in their best interest, even if it's not. There's three different tactics there for how you can get your way when other people around you don't necessarily have the same objectives
Well,
or same
you've
vision.
started to use some of this emotional language that we use around politics, which is get your own way, which is accurate,
Yeah.
but sounds really bad.
Yeah, yeah.
By the way, there was one other thing about politics that you didn't mention, which I think is really important. So I talked about the alignment of goals and outcomes.
Yeah.
And actually, I should slow down and just be really, really thoughtful. I want to go to a colleague in another department, and I want their help for me to achieve a particular project.
Yeah.
They are very busy. They have a long list of things they need to do. And for me to get buy-in for them to help me, I need to make sure that whether the thing I'm trying to achieve is aligned or not, I have to find some things that are aligned to their goals,
Yes.
sufficient that they would prioritize those activities to support me.
Yeah.
In other words, we've all been there when someone says, that's fantastic, I would love to help you. And then we're all very surprised when they don't help us.
Yes.
Actually, what we had there was my goals were not sufficiently aligned to your goals.
And
so there's that.
So I think this is touching on a really interesting and important thing, which is often when we talk about leadership and management and command, and we talk about alignment of culture and getting everybody to work cohesively as a team, we're often talking about alignment towards the organisational outcome, the task. What is the business outcome? What is the best interest so that the team can achieve the business outcomes or the organisational outcomes, or in a military context can support the strategic outcomes of the military campaign, or whatever it is. And so it becomes about leadership, it becomes about communication, and it's about just bringing everybody online so that everybody agrees to do the thing that helps support that main effort. I think what we're starting to uncover here is that in addition to an organisational goal, individuals will have their own goals, their own motivations, as well as their own opinions and views about how to achieve those things. So somebody in your office that you need to get to do something or agree to something, if we were all aligned perfectly, then this would just be a communication problem. And you would just need to explain why you need them to behave in a certain way and how that's in the best interest of the end objective. But because there might be an element of competitiveness. You might be in the long term in a position where you're going to get a job, where you're going to be a superior to that person.
But way
You might
more than
already
that.
be.
I think there's a far more important precursor to that, which is benign, i.e., talking about whether that person wants to advance or do something different. The first and most important one, which I see every day, is prioritization.
Yeah.
Frequently, and you made a really good point where you said, this is the company goal we want to achieve. Do we all agree? Let's assume we all agree. That's fine. Well, why didn't they do it? Well, they didn't do it because they subtly disagree. It's in order to achieve that goal, they have a set of prioritized activities.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's more often than not I've found, it's not that people go, you're an idiot, I don't agree with you. It's more likely they say, I have 7 other things which I am specifically being incentivized.
Yeah.
My organization have a greater impact on, and therefore I don't disagree with what you're saying, but it's just not high enough on my list. And I see that really frustrating people. I know I've said this a little bit earlier, but all the time I get colleagues saying to me, but I got on a call with this person. They agreed strongly with everything we were trying to do. They said they would help us. And then in the end, they didn't help us. They're terrible. No. This is,
Yeah.
I think this is this idea of strategy, politics, and power interacting, which is the answer is they were not as aligned as you think. And you probably don't understand what their motivations are. It is the correct application of power. I'm senior. Let me talk to you about why this is important. For example, strategy. We think that by doing this, this will lead to this outcome. And politics, I need your help. And I know that you've got other priorities. Let's talk about why
Yeah.
it is that
It is.
combination to create that outcome.
And that's before we even start talking about Machiavellian or malign behaviours.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
Because this is my point when people talk about office politics and they say, "Oh, Chris, you're awfully political." Actually, the definition of political that I think people have in their mind of someone wants to get something from other
They
people
want to get ahead.
and they'll say
Yeah.
whatever they have to say to get that. That is actually not what I mean. And sort of to wrap this up for me, it is the correct application of power, strategy, and politics in order to create the most effective outcome that I believe we need to do, which should be aligned to the business.
Yeah.
And it's the word effectiveness which is really important to me, as opposed to it being a personal thing. It's not for my glory. It is, I believe these are the things that the business needs to do to be successful. I am now attempting to be effective. And sometimes effective means taking my colleague out for lunch. Why? Well, they don't know me. They don't trust me. They don't understand my goals, my strategy and alignment, and I don't know theirs.
Yeah.
So actually taking them out for lunch is not making them feel loved.
And we're back now to where we started, which is power is about influence. It's about relationships between entities. And of course, by taking somebody out to lunch, you are building a relationship, and therefore the flow of power between you and that individual in both directions is now going to be easier. So I think we've started to uncover kind of what in the military we quite often call small p politics, which is the local politics of organisations, the office politics, the politics of hierarchies, in my world, the difficulty of the army working with the navy or with the air force, because we all have slightly different culture, slightly different language. These things are what create power imbalances often through, as you say, it's not malign, underlying sort of malign Machiavellian ideas. It's misalignment and miscommunication. But then there's what we call capital P or big P politics, which is the actual political power so in the military, we are part of government. The military acts on behalf of the government, and we are privileged to have the almost the sole prerogative of the use of force and the use of violence on behalf of the government. The government is the political power of the nation state, And therefore there is a butting up against military decision making with all of the small p politics that entails, and the cultural dynamics and all of the tactics and strategy and all of that good stuff, butting up against national policy and the political direction of government. And I think that's really important, because what you end up with there is the frictions between an organisation and a hierarchy, where an organisation has certain goals, certain objectives that they are either given or wish to attain. In the military context, it's often a directed objective that they are told to go and achieve. And then a lot of the power dynamics come from the relationship between government, politics, and military decision making. And there's some really, really good examples of that throughout history. Most recently, I think, and probably most tangibly, are the failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, where many books have been written on it, and we may do various podcast episodes on it in the future. We're not going to cover it now, but there is an exploration of why things went wrong. And there is one school of thought that says, this was the military being asked to do something that was inherently political, rebuilding nation states, and therefore they didn't have the tools in order to go and do that. There is another school of thought that says the military could have achieved success, whatever you define success as. However, they were restrained by the politics of the nation states. And remember, we're talking about a coalition of lots of nation states. When we went into Iraq, when we went into Afghanistan, these were coalitions of lots of nation states, all with slightly different objectives, slightly different strategic goals. And another school of thought is this is an inherently military challenge, of which the military became too political and overcomplicated the problem. I'm not going to get into which of those I believe.
No, but you're talking, you're touching on something maybe which is interesting. We should take a quick break, but I want to come back with a question straight after the break, which is: are we saying that the secret is to have the right balance between these things? Because you've just given some examples where the politics overcame the power, or the politics adversely influenced the power, and there are other cases where the power adversely and the strategy. Let's come back and maybe explore that a little bit later. About are we implying that you want the perfect mix of these things? Let's come back straight after this. Welcome back, and we can never tell. This is my point about understanding the microphones better. We've moved inside, and the reason we have moved inside is not because the weather has changed. It's because the RAF has decided to try and ruin our podcast recording. And Gareth is looking at his phone and going, or his watch rather, looking at the time and saying he can't believe they're flying so late.
It's 9:15 and the RAF are working. It's quite amazing.
Can I just say, having just been to RAF Cranwell, I don't think we're allowed to make those jokes. Anyway, just before we went away on the break, the conversation was around this interaction between strategy, politics, and power. And my question was, does this imply that you need a good balance of these things? Or rather, if you have the right balance, you are more likely to get the outcome you're looking for?
Yeah, and it's a great question. And I think the easy answer is to say yes, of course. But I actually disagree. And the reason I disagree is, yes, with the right balance, you're going to be able to navigate your way through these challenges and get to your objectives. You're going to be able to use power to navigate through the politics to expedite your strategy. The challenge is when you say the right balance, how you know what the right balance is. And I don't think you can, going into these things, know what the right balance is. And I think we're back to our old friend complexity. So if these things were complicated problems, you could apply a level of analysis and work out what the right approach is, and therefore you'd be quite comfortable to know all of the political factors, all of the power dynamics, and have a very clear strategic plan for how you would achieve your outcomes. And then you could just apply that. I think that by its definition, strategy works under uncertainty, its complexity. Power is about the dynamics between entities, and we're largely talking about people or collective groups of people in organisations. And so we're talking about complex organisations, and that's what politics is, isn't it? It's about opinions, it's about cultures, it's about organisational norms. And so I don't think you can go in with your eyes open, analyse the problem, and get the right balance.
No, and to be fair, I don't know. I was suggesting that sort of you can do this calculation, but these things relate to one another, and if there is an imbalance, that makes things harder. But
Yes.
I wonder whether actually the danger is this all becomes very theoretical. I think right now the Ukrainian conflict, Ukraine and Russia, and the part that the United States is playing on a potential ceasefire is a really, really interesting example of the situation.
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
that really is. Each of the parties have their own strategy. Each of these parties have their own power of different kinds, two clearly military battlefield powers, one global superpower and the other would be global superpower. And then, of course, there's the politics behind it. So what's interesting here is the United States notionally has a very different set of goals and politics driving it
Yeah, absolutely.
compared to the others.
But of course, the strategic goals are things we can make a guess at, or we can even do some informed analysis, but we don't know. We don't know what Vladimir Putin wants out of this definitively. And so it's a question of brinkmanship, it's a question of second guessing, it's a question of, you know, cultural and psychological and social analysis. And then from a power point of view, you know, how do you define the power dynamic? Who has more power? Well, you know, there is economic power, there is social power, there is brand power, there is the power of disgust, there is the power of fear, there is and threat, there is military hard power, there is soft power, and so there's a whole load of dynamics in there. So it's really, really difficult, even, you know, with the benefit of hindsight, to actually definitively state what the strategy, power, and political relationships are. And that's why there are lots of rapporteurs, economists, armchair generals, social media, you know,
Us.
yeah, absolutely, podcasters, writers, you know, historians, all looking at this and still trying to make sense of it. And you take historical examples. So I've got an example in my notes here about the Vietnam War. And yet I know that the example I'm going to give as a balance of power, strategy, and politics is just one perspective. And it's a very blunt and simplified perspective that will undoubtedly be wrong. And so these are really, really, really complex, difficult things. I think where you're onto something, though, is you can tell when the balance is wildly wrong. You can tell where there is an imbalance in power that is not allowing you or is not in your favour for achieving your strategic objectives. And I think what's important, if we bring this back to small p local office politics, or, you know, really, really less geostrategic problem sets, the thing that's important to recognise is these relationships exist. The relationship between strategy, power, and politics is there whether you like it or not. And the more you try to understand it, the more you start to get to a point of trying to empathize with other people's points of view, trying to understand other people's perspectives, even if that is to disagree with them. You can at least start to understand why why you think their argument is illogical or wrong-headed,
or not sufficiently powerful,
or
like you
why
said.
they are not sufficiently powerful, or why you're not sufficient. And then you can start to work out why your strategy might not be appropriate, and you can adapt it.
I want to change direction a little bit because one thing we haven't talked about is abuse of power.
Yeah.
And the reason why I think that's very interesting, the first thing is I think, again, across the spectrum of an office through to a nation state, you regularly see an abuse of power. An abuse of power can be significant, but it can also be quite subtle. An abuse of power can be as simple as do it because I told you to do it and I'm in charge and I have the ability to make a bad thing happen to you, all the way through to if you don't sign on this dotted line, I will bomb your country. And so rather than sort of spend a lot of time debating abuse of power, for now at least, we can assume it's there. I have a hypothesis though, and I want to get your sense on this, which is an abuse of power is typically temporary. Now, temporary can be over a period of years, but ultimately, the abuse of power, you are spending some of your credit, and that credit only extends for so long. And so, I'll give an example, which I think is really interesting today. Again, we'll go back to the Ukraine. The United States is effectively saying, and people have different opinions on whether this is what they're asking for. The United States is saying we hold significant power, both in terms of the Ukrainian government, but also potentially the Russian government, in terms of both military power that we can provide the Ukrainians, but also in terms of economic power and things we can do. We are going to get you, we want you to do something. In this case, it is sign a peace treaty. We want you to do that. And there is an interesting point about the really good example recently was the signing of the treaty for rare earth materials.
Yeah.
Whether or not the current version of that treaty is fairer, I think outside of the United States, there was a general consensus that it was the initial proposal was incredibly one-sided.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point because you've just said outside of the United States there is and of course there's lots of people inside the United States as well, but I assume you mean not the current administration.
Yes.
But you're talking about a consensus view, and that's important because an abuse of power is an opinion
held by other people,
held by either the person being abused or the consensus view from outside. If you are the person, notionally abusing power, you won't see it as an abuse of power. There's a great quote by Lord Acton, which is, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." There is a point there about the more power you have, the stronger you are against the other entity, the more likely you are to use that power unsparingly. And the only checks on that are morality and ethics. So if you are somebody or an organisation that has thought about and regularly thinks about where the limits of that power are, and we've talked about toxic leadership before and the traits there. So if you are a psychopathic person, you're probably not going to be bothered by that. Or the institutions that limit your ability to have power. And that's where that point about absolute power comes in. So,
well, here's the reason why I brought this up, which is, and I think you've said that very well. There are many people that feel in the United States that the power that is being applied to generate an outcome in the Ukraine conflict is for a good reason. We don't want people killing themselves. we're here altruistically to stop the killing, and therefore it's a good thing. But if you now flip it around, I wonder whether this is a reasonable outcome. There's a point at which the Ukrainians saying, we don't care anymore what you think, because you are applying power to create an outcome that is good for you, but not good for us. And so there's this really interesting balance between successful application of power has its limits. And when you exceed those limits, you get an unexpected outcome. Almost, if you overuse your power, at some point that power ceases to become as effective as it is.
Yeah,
And I have to be careful, because at the point of a gun, when does my power cease to be effective? That doesn't
yeah,
extend. But in this particular case, I think that's really, really interesting, which is, if the United States says, we want you to sign on the dotted line, Ukraine, and we don't care that you don't think this is fair, there is a point at which the Ukraine might say, I prefer to try the alternative, even if you are threatening me with these various things.
yeah. So I think,
Likewise, political power,
yeah,
that there is, if a political party and if a government says to the people, well, you might think that this is not acceptable, we're going to introduce this thing called the poll tax, all of a sudden. So there's this delicate, maybe a surprising sense of being careful with power, and maybe it comes back exactly to the point you made about
but in both,
finding that right balance of
yeah,
politics, power, and strategy.
I don't want to be the pessimist, but I'm going to have to
You're
be.
going to be the pessimist.
Yeah, I don't think that holds as a general rule. In both of those examples, the checks and balances are the wider institutions. When those institutions get bent out of shape so much that they no longer function and they no longer create those checks and balances, then actually the abuse of power in itself consolidates more power. And we've seen that.
But I don't disagree. But and now you as being the pessimist, I'm being the optimist. Is this a time thing, though? Is this a time thing? Because the more that power is abused, let me put it like this: how many dictators have consolidated power for many, many years, for 20 years? Syria, Bashar al-Assad, the family consolidated power, and then all of a sudden there was no power. In fact, let's try and play with some terrible hypotheticals. This idea that at some point Ukraine says, actually, we are willing to ignore the benefits of being allied with the United States. All of a sudden, the power stops becoming effective. Here's another thing as well. The person in an office who says, I'm a vice president, you will do what I say.
Yeah.
Okay, that works for a little bit. And then if I were to do that and walk into every meeting and say, you're going to do it because I'm a vice president, all of a sudden there is a point, probably pretty quickly, where my power becomes ineffective and people start just ignoring me because I'm the crazy guy. And so
Yeah,
there's a point here about,
I think if you're going to say at some point, then your history, you can pick and choose your evidence. Like North Korea has consolidated power through massive abuse, and it has continued as a dynasty for 3 generations without being unchecked, and there's no end in sight. There are plenty of CEOs who've become the CEO of their organizations by being toxic leaders and abusing power to get to the top. And there are institutional reasons why that's been enabled. So there are lots and lots of examples you could pick of abuse of power being checked and it all unraveling. And then there are also probably lots of examples you can pick of it being really quite a good strategy for that individual in the long term. So I think this is, and it comes back to this point about whose strategy, whose power, whose politics. What are we measuring against? What are you deciding is an abuse? What are you deciding is good or bad as an outcome? And what are you deciding is the power metric that you're measuring against?
well, and what are you willing to pay for that?
And what are you willing to pay for it? And we're back to, this is complex stuff. These are things that, institutions are formed to try and create systems that are never perfect but kind of work. This is where academics, economists, historians spend careers studying the interactions between politics, power, and strategy. But I think what's important is to recognise that there is an interplay. And if we take the current situation in the US, I was editing the podcast episode on Stalin earlier today. So by the time this goes out, that will have already gone out, but it's the second episode. And we started off by talking about what was happening in the world. We recorded that episode just as Donald Trump had revealed his extreme tariffs, which many of which have now been rolled back on, and we've seen how that's sort of panned out. But at the time, we were talking about what that meant, and I said there is no real comparison between Stalinism and Donald Trump. There is probably some Stalinist attributes to Vladimir Putin and Russia, but it's probably a stretch to go that far in the US. What we've seen since recording that episode, and arguably there was some evidence of it when we recorded it, is a very deliberate attempt to change the other bits of the institution to stop there being checks and balances on the executive power. And we've seen, and I think we made the point in that episode that Stalin, it was life and death. Here we're talking about, people's careers, jobs, financial wealth, not necessarily life and death. But we have now seen, I was reading an article today about a US citizen who is the son of illegal immigrants in the US being deported without their cancer medication when they're at stage 4 cancer. So we are talking about life and death things. We're talking about people being life imprisoned. We're talking about people being deported without the legal processes being fully enacted. So we're starting to get to a very dark point where the checks and balances on power are being deliberately targeted, changed, eroded, so that the executive can do more. Now, they would argue they're doing that for the interest of the country, for the betterment of the US. And we may look back in 50 years and we might have to, eat humble pie and say, actually, in the grand scheme of things, this stopped, American decline and America's in a much better place. I don't personally think that will be the case. I feel very uncomfortable with the direction of travel that the US administration is currently going in. But that might be the case. The judgment will be strategically did it achieve the right goals? And in this case, I think the easy thing to measure is the power of the US in the global standing and the lifestyle of your average American citizen. And that can be measured in, wealth, GDP per capita. It can be measured in freedoms that they have. It can be measured in life expectancy. There are lots of metrics you can use. I think this is a really interesting case study in that power dynamic being used to try and achieve strategic goals that aren't necessarily the goals that they are claiming to be. So I think this is about a very small group of people trying to gain power for their own purpose rather than to gain power for the American people.
I mean, we're coming towards the end, but I think
we also talked about an hour ago about not getting political.
Well, but I think something we've implied, but I think it's important to talk about. I think on a previous episode, maybe just something else happened in my life. I talked to, actually, it was with a colleague I work with who had never fired a gun before. And he was on a work trip in the United States, and he visited an old friend of his, and the old friend said, let's go to the shooting range. And I know that this is a left-leaning, decent, upstanding human being who is the last person you would imagine would want to fire guns. In fact, you could imagine that he would want to not fire guns because of, the danger they represent and the power they exert. And I said to him, "Did you enjoy it?" And he looked at me and he had a big grin on his face and sparkling eyes and said, "Heck yeah." And so in that case, what was fascinating to me was this idea that guns have pretty bad outcomes, whichever way you look at it. And yet there's something compelling and exciting about a gun, which
Yeah.
actually I think goes a long way to explain why people are so excited about guns. And I say that myself, having fired weapons. There is something empowering about firing
Yeah.
weapons. But the reason why I sort of give that example is I think it's fair to say there is something exciting and addictive about power. And so we've talked about getting the right balance. I think I still maintain if you can find the right balance, it gives you the most effective outcome. If you have the right strategy, the right political direction, or the right political support and the right power, you can move mountains.
But I think you only control one of those three things.
I, I think control is a strong word, but I think
You can control your strategy.
you can control your strategy.
You can't control the power dynamics that
You
are inherent in the system you're in.
You're right, but I think that again, using the Second World War as an example, I would argue that it was a combination of strategy, politics, and power that was applied that creates an effective outcome, rather than spend a lot of time debating.
Well, yeah.
The point I wanted to make here is
So I do think this is important because I think this is the crux of what we're talking about. I would say the Second World War was the right strategy. You know, you can argue about how efficiently that was played out and whether, you know, the right learning took place in the right places and we could have done it better or quicker or whatever. But effectively, overall, the right strategy was applied in the context of the power dynamic that was out of the Allies' control, largely, you know, what territory the Axis powers had, how the rest of the world felt about the situation is outside of the control.
but it was
And
what they controlled though.
but this is my point. It's within a wider system. They weren't fighting against themselves.
That I agree. No, that I agree.
So you're always talking about the system within which you are competing. So you don't control the power dynamic. In the same way that I run a company and I don't control the political environment that this company operates in.
That's a great
I can control my strategy, but there are legal and policy things that I have to take into account. The power dynamics that I have are based on my relationships with clients, suppliers, potential customers, competitors, all of which are out of my control. So I have to take into account those power dynamics. I have to take into account that politics, and then I have to apply my strategy.
That's very fair, and actually that's a really good clarification. I think you're, by the way, exactly right, and that's what makes this very, very difficult. But actually, maybe I was getting at a subtly different point, which was the things you have under your control. You have a degree of power that you bring.
Yeah.
You have a degree of political. I mean, if it's your company, it's a smaller sort of group. But if I am saying to my business, we are going to compete against that company, within my business, I have a certain amount of power. I have a certain political will and an ability to get people to behave in a certain way, and I have a specific strategy. So for my definition, it was the things that are under my control, and that's what I meant about getting the balance right. I see why actually I've been disagreeing, is that I don't disagree. I can't balance the external factors, but actually I can balance the internal factors. And I would suggest that's not because it guarantees success, it's because it drives the most effective outcome that I can do. But it's funny that that's actually a really good clarification, because I think we were arguing slightly different points. The point I wanted to make though about power, which I think is a really important reminder, and again, it's another one of these, everyone can point at something at a global level where someone was, as it were, corrupted by power, because it is attractive, because it is addictive.
Yeah.
I like it when I can say to people, do a thing, and they don't question me. Well, if they don't question me, I can do it again.
Yeah.
And if they don't question me, it's probably because I'm brilliant. So you see this sort of, you see this cycle of power corrupting people to your
You
thing.
also end
And
up doing things that are in your interest rather than in the interest of the organisation that you serve.
yes, and
You know,
I think it almost, it's my example of if you get the balance wrong.
yeah,
But the point I wanted to make specifically is there are people who have power in organizations. You have to be extraordinarily careful about how you apply that power,
yes,
because it is actually, I would argue, once you start being successful, the power starts to corrupt even more. And all we have to do is look at Mr. Musk, who, personal view, I think he thinks everything he says is brilliant and genius. And so, therefore, as his views become more and more outlandish, he says, well, no, no, they're not outlandish in the slightest. In fact, you're very lucky that I'm clever enough. And by the way, did you know I'm the richest man in the world? And so there's a little bit of a danger there.
yeah, absolutely. And back to our whipping boy for this episode, Donald Trump. Do you remember when he said, "There's no one who knows more about rockets than me"? There are rocket scientists who know more about rockets than you, Donald Trump. But it's that, yeah, these are toxic traits, and we talked about this with Colonel Oliver Lee, where we talked about the fact that all of us are fallible. All of us will, have moments of weakness. All of us will do things that are selfish. All of us will make mistakes. We will make the wrong decisions because we're all human. The difference is organizations that constantly get their people to talk about these things, to reaffirm what the purpose is, to talk about what the value of the individual in the team is. We've just come back from a really good chat. It won't have gone out by the time this episode goes out, but look out for it. The chat we had with the team, the leadership team up at RAF Cranwell. Yeah, absolutely brilliant conversations around the role of leaders in an organization where they recognize that you lead. It's a privilege, but it's part of the mission to make the organization better, not just in terms of achieving the mission today, but leaving the organization in a better place. Then you have institutional checks and balances. So it's the whole purpose in democratic constitutional systems is to make sure, some of them are evolved, some of them are designed, but is to make sure that there are balancing powers to make sure that when you get that urge to do something that might be pushing the moral or ethical boundaries, there are other people or other organizations that are there to check you. And this is where the US is perhaps the easiest to explain. There are, in theory, three balancing power organizations. The organization that makes the laws, that designs the contracts from which society operates, and that is Congress and the Senate. And there are similar institutions at state level and at county level, etc. And they design the laws. There is the judiciary, and they uphold the laws. And they are, in theory, non-partisan, and they apply the legal judgments to uphold the laws that the elected representatives have created. And then there is the executive, which is the president and the president's power, that is designed to create a level of balance between these two institutions, and also to give a level of liquidity or fluidity so that you can be responsive, which is why the executive has executive powers to theoretically, in the short term, override legal precedent using executive orders. So things like national emergencies. The problem we've got is that there is a natural tendency to try to grab power, and the two of those three institutions are large bodies of people. The judiciary is a hierarchical system of lots of different courts, it's very difficult to make your way through that process. But Congress is a political game, as is the Senate, because you have to be elected, you are representative of your people, and they are large bodies of people that work in parties. The executive is a very, very small group of people with one person as the de facto king or kingmaker.
Well, I believe the word king is not allowed.
Yeah, well, Pope is probably more appropriate, given that as we're recording this, we're only a week from having a new Pope, but also from Donald Trump posting on his own social media a picture of himself as Pope. I'm not going to comment on that.
No, he stated that, quote, can't Catholics take a joke? And then he went on to point out that he had nothing to do with it. He'd only heard about it, and it certainly wasn't him, which I enjoy.
Right, so it's easier for the executive to push boundaries, to make changes. And what's happened, and this is not Donald Trump, this is repeatedly throughout both Republican and Democrat administration,
The use of executive
powers and the eroding of those balancing conditions has led to a point where the executive has the tipping point to where they can absolutely start pulling apart the institutions.
Well, I think that this is a different conversation about then the weakening of those institutions. But I think there's a really interesting point to take away from this, which is if you are in power, you, and I would argue this is what has happened in the United States with these different the different incumbents, was it is too slow and difficult to generate the change that we wish to be true, and for good reason, and therefore you break the rules. You say, well, I'm going to do more of these, and the problem is you have to do there's a fantastic sketch with two Germans with skulls and crossbones on their hats, and they turn around and says, Hans, are we the bad guys?
Mitchell and Webb.
Yeah. And the point there is, of course, people who feel they are doing the right thing for good reasons,
yes,
feel that, well, we're only breaking the rules for good.
Yeah.
And the problem is, though, breaking the rules for good, but you've just created precedent for people to do exactly the same thing for potentially bad reasons.
Yeah.
So this idea of power corrupting, and this idea of the misapplication of power, and in the way you described it, and both ignoring, usurping, and going around the checks and balances, is a very, very dangerous thing, because how do you know whether you're doing it for the right reasons or the wrong reasons? Well, you probably can't tell. It's up to other people to judge that for you. Which goes back to, that's exactly why there's checks and balances on these things. Not to necessarily say is it a good or a bad thing, but it says you've democratically been elected. You do get to make choices, but you have to make those choices within the constraints of these other balancing forces. And again, we've just talked a lot about the US government, our old friend Donald Trump, but actually the point is this is also very true in a small organization. I see this all the time. Here is a rule, here is a framework for how we do things in a software organization. Someone says, but you don't understand.
Yeah.
This is special. We would normally do X, Y, or Z.
Yeah.
But we are in extraordinary circumstances. And so I am now going to declare we are not going to do those things, and it'll be all right.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, the checks and balances, if they don't exist to say stop, we do that for good reason.
And I think this is where when we release the Cranwell episode, the Tedder Academy from RAF Cranwell, we will talk about one of the roles of a leader is to leave the organisation in a better state than you found it. And it's not all about achieving the mission that's directly in front of you. It's about how is the organisation prepared to achieve the next mission as well. And I think your point there is so important, and it comes back to the discussion we had with Paul Tremelling about breaking rules. And we've referenced this, several times, but it's a really important point, which is rules are there as checks and balances. They are there to stop you from overextending. They're there to stop you abusing power. There might be times where you need to break those rules, but that should be the exception, not the rule. And it should be very, very clear that you've done it. It should be clear that you're going to do it. You shouldn't blindly be walking into a situation where the rules are just eroding. We're special, we don't follow those rules anymore. You follow the rules and then you break them by exception. And that's what Paul talked about in that situation where he flew below the deck. It was dangerous, but he took the risk very positively, knowing he was doing it, given a very, very positively defined situation. And then as soon as that was over, straight back to flying within the rules. After that, that should be thoroughly investigated without, vindictiveness, but to understand why and to make sure that the system is learning from it. If you're in a situation where, because we've broken the rules once and it helped us, that's okay, we can keep doing it. You're now into that erosion of those checks and balances. This is where the abuse of power
Well,
creeps in.
and we talked about my favourite phrase from a couple of weeks ago, normalising deviancy.
That's exactly what it is.
It turns out this is really, really hard. It's this classic thing where every single episode where we've talked about something touches almost every other episode we've done. It isn't just about power, politics, and strategy. It's power, politics, strategy, and leadership. It's power, policy, strategy, leadership,
Complexity,
and every other topic.
Connecting frameworks.
And really difficultly, me might think, of course, I'm doing all the right things with my power. And it's almost, well, that's what someone abusing power would probably think of themselves.
Quite.
So maybe this is a good place to finish, to say, in quite a depressing way, power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. But it's difficult. And I do think that idea of thinking about the interaction of these things becomes really, really important as well.
Let's go right back to the very beginning of this episode where you said you're slightly uncomfortable using the word power because it feels like it's a negative. But as we very quickly uncovered, power is just the dynamic between entities that flows, enabling people to achieve things. So power is neither good or bad. Power is what you have as a relationship, as an organisation or as an individual, between you and others. And with great power comes great responsibility. And that responsibility comes in two forms. It comes with the checks and balances of the system that you're working within, be those legal or policy or procedures or convention, but they're important. And therefore the move fast to break things idea of, well, the rules don't apply is a very, very dangerous line to tread. And secondly, the constant checking of oneself that you're doing things for the right reasons, doing the right thing. And it's quite often said, isn't it? Leadership is about doing the right thing, not the easy thing. Doing the thing that you know in your gut is the right thing to do. It might not be the best interest for you at the time. It might not be the easiest thing. It might open a can of worms. It might result in you losing your career that you love dearly. And we've, heard from Colonel Ollie Lee about that. But it's about doing the right thing. If you constantly talk about these things, if you have these discussions, if you think about them, then you're more likely to recognize a situation where you have a choice and it's right or wrong.
That seems like a great place to stop. Brilliant advertisement for those people who are either relatively new listeners to the podcast or people who just want to go back and listen to things again. We talked about some really excellent episodes that we've recorded. You started by talking about our influencers episodes around Stalin, which was fascinating to me. how someone has applied and abused so much power. On the other hand, we talked about Paul Tremelling episode, who was a fast jet pilot in the Royal Navy, flying various aircraft. A fascinating view around how to break the rules, but actually fantastic aviation stories as well. We've also advertised what's coming very soon is we'll have a couple of episodes talking to the Tedder Institute at RAF Cranwell about the Royal Air Force's view around leadership. And as Gareth said, fascinating conversation, really interesting, very practical, very well thought out as well. So that's coming soon. So please do, if you haven't already subscribed to the podcast on Thursdays, pretty much every Thursday, it'll drop into your podcast inbox.
There's a couple more I would recommend as well. We did an episode with Wakeman Bourne on why people do bad things.
Excellent.
And I think that covers a lot of the ground we've talked about today in terms of that slippery slope and those erosions of norms and the normalization of deviancy. We did a really early episode on strategy and what strategy is. And I think that links into this quite nicely.
I think we did a couple of episodes.
Yeah.
I was really struggling between strategy and tactics.
So that's probably sort of episodes 4 and 5 of. And we did a really good couple of episodes with David Anderson, Royal Marine Sniper, talking about, again, normalization of deviancy and how you train to get things right and prevent these things happening.
Lots to go back and listen to if you haven't already heard. And again, to connect some of these concepts again together. If you are of the mind to contact us, we are available on battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. We are also on Battling with Biz on Twitter or X, and we're also on Blue Sky Battling with Biz as well, so you can follow us there.
So that's at Battling with Biz with a Z.
We hope you've enjoyed this exploration. I think today is a bit more of one of those examples where we are exploring this ourselves and trying to work through some of these ideas. Hope you found it interesting. We'll see you next time on Battling with Business.
Brilliant. Cheerio.